Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good, good. Well, thrilled to have Andrew Bernstein back with us. This may be your fifth visit. I think if this were SNL, we'd have to give you a smoking jacket or something.
Well, it's always good to be on with you guys. I think of you jocularly as the Swig and Schiff show, and I think we'll swig a lot of Schiff today. Not Adam Schiff, of course, but a
The
whole
bad shift.
yeah, the good Schiff. We're gonna swig the good Schiff.
I'm the good shift lollipop.
There you go. We get a little shtick here with our philosophy.
I know, right? But beyond
Adam Schiff is permanently banned from the show.
I can't blame you for that. Can't blame you for that, William. He is an evil creature.
So your new book, American Racism, is a fascinating topic. I want to get into, I noticed in your piece on whether the left or right was the bigger threat, even though you conclude the left is a bigger threat, you start off with a litany of charges against the right. And in this book, you seem to do something similar. You start off acknowledging the long history of racism in this country, even though by the end you're seeing the threat maybe from a different direction. Are you trying to steel man and just build the objective case by doing that?
Well, first and foremost, want to acknowledge the truth about history. I'm always clamoring at the leftists that we need the full truth about American history, not just slavery and all the bad things, but all the principle of individual rights and the abolitionist movement and all the good things in American history. So I want the full truth. The full truth includes that there has been in the past and remains to some extent today a great deal of anti-Black or anti-non-white racism amongst white Americans. So wanted to show the truth there, but also a part of the essence of that booklet on American racism is how much progress we've made, in this country certainly since the heyday of the civil rights era in the 1960s. Certainly I think we made a lot of progress. I think the evidence is very strong for that. And then the deeper question, of course, is why would it enable the United States to make progress regarding this form of racism, in contrast to other places around the world that have not made this kind of progress. And of course, the answer to that is the principle of individual rights in our heritage that's lacking in other cultures around the world.
One thing you mentioned in your historical analysis is that the racism was primarily on from the Democratic side or the left, and it's like wasn't from the Republicans. So I think that's an interesting point that a lot of objectivists and conservatives have been making, is that there's this confusion about the history and this attempt to rewrite the history. The racism didn't originate from the Republican Abraham Lincoln side.
Oh, absolutely right. That's also part of the full truth of American history. It was always the Democrats who were supporting slavery, and then the Jim Crow laws and the Klan and lynchings and violence against Blacks. It was always the Democrats. The Republicans, at the very least, didn't support it, and at best wanted to stop the spread of slavery into the new territories, and of course, eventually abolish slavery altogether. And it wasn't the Republicans who supported the Jim Crow laws and the Klan. Everything was always the Democrats. It's like the Democrats have morphed, and there's more to the Democratic Party than just anti-Black racism. But that was a big part of it for a long time. The Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats, were segregationists. But it's like they morphed from this kind of, you look at, this is white supremacist mentality. The George Wallace, governor of Alabama. People, will know the line when I say it. In Birmingham, they loved the governor, but we all did what we could do. Even my students go, "That's Leonard Skinner." Yeah, Sweet Home Alabama, right? Who's the governor? I don't know. It was George Wallace, right? Was a brutal segregationist. And these are basically white supremacists. And in the broad sense, they're like American Nazis. You know, they're white supremacists, they're racist, they're violent, and National Socialism is a form of left. It's a collectivist socialist manifestation. It's like they morphed from a basically Nazi view to a Marxist communist view in the mid 20th century. They talk about the Great Switch. The Democrats, say, yeah, well, the Great Switch was, yeah, we used to be racist, but now we support Black Americans, and the Republicans became racist. They talk about that as the Great Switch. No, there was a Great Switch, but that's inaccurate. The Great Switch is the Democrats moved from basically a Nazi philosophy to basically a Marxist communist one. That's the switch.
Yeah, maybe paternalism, where they don't go from treating Black people as individuals with agency so much as voters to be caretaken or focused on their oppression. Um, you quote Larry Elder in 2000 saying that Blacks are more racist than whites, but to me, part of the deeper issue is there's a double standard where we've been told for years that Black people can't be racist, or that historically marginalized groups basically can't be bigoted for being angry at their oppressors. So according to that, there is no Black racism.
Right. And it's impossible to be racist towards a white person is part of the, leftist theme to the. Now that's, that's just false. If you're slave and you hate, you're a Black slave, enslaved by white Americans, and you hate the white slave drivers, I mean, that's a rational conclusion. I think because of, it's like being a Jew in Germany and you hate the Nazis. That's a rational conclusion because you are brutally oppressed. In fact, you're physically subjugated. You'll be whipped or hanged or gassed in the gas chamber if the slave doesn't obey, and you're going to be gassed in the gas chamber no matter what you do if you're a Jew under the Nazis. But that you hate the legitimate oppressor, the real oppressor, the actual oppressor, is not irrational. I don't think it's a form of racism. But Black Americans in 2024 are not oppressed. I mean, the Jim Crow era is in the rearview mirror. 100 years in the past, certainly 60 years in the past, going back to the heyday of the civil rights movement. So today, I think, you could point out that white racism, anti-Black or anti-non-white racism still exists in the United States. But is it strong enough? Is it so institutionalized that it has the power to prevent a determined Black man or woman from getting an education in America, from having a successful career in America, from having a loving, romantic relationship and family, from having a fulfilled life in America today? No, I think the answer to that is no. And so I don't think Black Americans are oppressed. And if they do hate white people, yes, it's racism. And I use the example. You guys remember Colin Ferguson? I quoted, I cited him as an example in the booklet.
Right.
Ferguson was a Black Jamaican immigrant to the United States who turned out at his trial that people testified how he hated white people. And he got on the Long Island Railroad. What was that? December of 1993. It's more than 30 years ago now, and shot up, killed I forget how many white people and wounded a bunch of others. Not to say that this Black mass murderer, was not a racist is ridiculous. I mean, his hatred of whites drove him to murder. By the 1980s, 1990s, white racism in the country was not sufficient to stop, a determined Black man from having a successful life, a fulfilled life in the United States. Might have to face obstacles that whites didn't have to face, but they're not insurmountable by the time that he was living in the United States in the 1980s and early 90s.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question to ask. What are the statistics, or like how much racism against Blacks is there today, in general or like institutionally? And one of the first examples you give in the book, I think it's the very first paragraph, is the George Floyd instance where he died under police custody. You called it an example of racial injustice, but I have a different opinion about it. I actually watched the whole trial, and it seems to me that he died because he was resisting arrest and was under, severe drug intoxication, and his body couldn't sustain the stress level that was being caused on his body. And I think the coroner's decision was basically that he had a heart attack or something like that. So I'm not sure it's an example of racial injustice. It's more of an example, I think, of just an accident, a terrible accident that was, has blame on both sides.
Yeah, I know. I understand. I understand what you're saying, William. The coroner's report came out subsequently. Did they conclude that he died from an overdose of fentanyl rather than from asphyxiation from the officer having his knee on his neck?
Oh no, it wasn't from asphyxiation. It was from the drug, from a heart attack, and then secondary cause was drug intoxication, I think.
With fentanyl, right?
Yeah, with fentanyl. And he was clearly on fentanyl, and I think some of the evidence didn't even come out in the court, that like he like tossed a pill aside while he was being arrested, and then he had one in his mouth. So, and then another theory I had is that they woke him up from his drug-induced slumber. And so I think his body was in that transition phase where you're waking up, and so he wasn't fully alert. And when he started resisting arrest, he was just causing more trouble for his body because he was causing too much stress for his sleepy body.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all probably true. And if I do a second edition of this booklet, I'll have to rewrite my my analysis of the George Floyd case. But in the past, I don't know that. I mean, there's still police brutality. We see it directed against whites also. If you remember the Tony Timpa case in Dallas. It was a white guy. They had him on the ground. I think he was he on drugs? When he come off his meds, he was resisting arrest. The cops had him on the ground. The cop had his knee on his back, and Tony Timpa died. There are cases of police brutality. I don't know if it's directed today. I don't know if it's directed more against Black Americans than against white Americans. I don't know. I think criminal brutality is vastly more dangerous to Black Americans than police brutality is. But in the past, certainly during the Jim Crow era, certainly there was a great deal of. It's interesting because on the one hand, if during the Jim Crow years, if a Black guy was accused or suspected of committing a crime against a white victim, the police often were, brutal. On the other, so they had police brutality, against Blacks. On the other hand, if a Black criminal was suspected or a Black guy was suspected of crime against somebody in the Black community, the cops often took a very, nonchalant attitude. They often just didn't really care, what happened to Black victims. So on one hand, the cops were overly brutal to Black Americans back then. On the other hand, they were not enforcing the law at all, and let Black criminals, in many cases, as long as their crimes were limited to Black victims, just let them slide. So
there's certainly there's certainly that terrible history of racism and police brutality. But do you think it's getting better? Do you think it's going in the right direction where police are learning better techniques to they're also dealing with the more violent and abusive, populace who don't respect them and will like run away.
Lawmakers are telling people not to respect the police in some cases.
Yeah, we're moving in a very bad direction. Regarding police brutality, my guess is I'd like to go back and reread what Heather McDonald, who's a expert on these issues, has written on this. My guess is that the police are being trained not to engage in certain brutal activities. I don't think police brutality is that much of an issue anymore. Although I'm not an expert on this, but criminal brutality is is a terrible issue. And, Talib Starks wrote was a Black American conservative writer, wrote a really courageous book called Black Lives Matter, LIES, Black Lives Matter on this issue. He pointed out, well, he's not the only source, but I mean, a number of people have pointed out year after year after year after year, there's thousands of Black Americans murdered in this country, 5, 6, 7,000 a year. It's unbelievable. I called it a Holocaust, and I think it is. Year after year, it adds up to hundreds of thousands of people as the years go on, because it's been going on for decades. And in 90%, year after year after year, 90% of the cases, the perpetrator is a Black criminal. And Talib Starks points out, the Black population is 13% of the American population, roughly. 47% of the homicide victims and a staggering 52% of the homicide perpetrators are Black Americans. And we raised the question, what's the gravest threat to Black lives? The answer is obvious. It's the drug gangs, the drug dealers, the gangbangers, the little gun busters, as they're known in the projects. These are the guys who are really dangerous. Now, they're mostly shooting other gangbangers, but innocent people often get caught in the crossfire. And in recent years, they've adopted this charming habit of murdering the children of rival gangbangers, shooting them in the head and then chortling with glee as the kid dies. So these are the real men. It's not, and of course, the leftist mantra to defund the police. I mean, we need to defund the Democrat Party is what we need to defund. They're a menace to innocent people. But
I love how you point out leftist supremacy is the real problem.
Yeah, it is. Defund the police is insane. If the goal is to save Black lives, which it isn't, but if the goal was to save Black lives, then it's insane to defund the police. That means the gangbangers are less restrained, not more. And when Giuliani was mayor of New York City, he and his police commissioner William Bratton, they really cracked down on all types of crime, and they got these guys off the street and put them away. And the rate of violent crime came down in New York City in the 90s and early 2000s, to a very, very low level of crime. So we refund the police is what we need to do. RE-fund, refund the police and have very, very strict law enforcement here for criminals. That's the way to protect innocent people, including Black lives.
Sure. It's almost as if the left is planning to violently take over cities, and they're preparing the way by saying, "Hey, don't fund your police force."
Yeah, I mean,
they want to have no resistance, when they decide to storm City Hall and take over the government. There's just going to be no one to resist.
Well, I heard the Capitol Police are opening many branches around the country, so for what that's worth. Andy, aren't there levels of racism? I mean, shouldn't we be making distinctions between, just being weary of someone that looks different versus those using the language of genocide or collective punishment?
Well, I mean, people who advocate, verbally advocate genocide, and we see the revival of, resurgence of Jew hatred, since the October 7th, the appalling October 7th attacks in Israel, and masquerading as support for the Palestinians and anti-Israel. But people talking about killing all the Jews and everything. Now that's comes from jihadists, that subset of the Muslim population that supports jihad, from leftists, and from the relatively few white supremacists who are still around. They all agree on one thing: they hate the Jews, and they'd be very happy to annihilate the Jewish population. But yeah, that is appalling. And again, the left. I get in trouble for this, but I gotta speak the truth. As a devout atheist, I am not a fan of Judaism, and I'm not a fan of Christianity. But Islam is the worst by far. Islam is evil. I mean, Islam is evil. I'll repeat that. Its very nature its very essence is to conquer the infidels and do whatever it takes. It's the difference.
Enlightenment.
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. For sure. Notice the difference, though, between Islam and Christianity that greatly favors Christianity. In fact, several differences. But one is the founder of Christianity was not a warrior, not a warlord, not a jihadist. He wasn't fighting holy war. The founder of Christianity was a man. So far as we get his story in the Gospels, was a man of peace. And so when Christians perpetrate, aggressive warfare on their enemies, other Christians or the infidels, the non-believers, they're living in contradiction to the teachings of their founder. So it's easier to, I think, to remediate the evils, the violent aggression in Christianity. Whereas in Islam, the jihadists are living in accordance not only with what Muhammad said, but with what Muhammad did. Muhammad himself was a warlord who led, Islamic forces against the infidels and claims that Islam is the one true faith and it's destined to rule the world, and God mandates that, and anything that they do to further that is the good. It's very difficult to remediate the violent, aggressive jihadist mentality in Islam because it's of the essence of the religion. And so Islam is evil. The leftists apologize for it. If they hear me speaking now, their heads are gonna explode and they're gonna scream at me, Islamophobia, and so on and so forth. But the leftists spew out and this anti-Jew hatred that they've been spewing out over the last few months is congruent with their basic hatred of white people generally. I mean, they spew out hatred for white people, whether Jew or Christian or whatever. Well, they got to be Western, maybe not white Muslims like the Iranians, the ancient Persians, but certainly for white Westerners, Jews, Christians, people of European descent. I mean, every day you hear it. It was that professor at Rutgers a few years ago said we got to take white people out, and there was that New York City psychiatrist speaking at Yale a couple of years ago said she fantasizes about shooting white people in the head, it's an everyday thing from leftists.
And it's acceptable for them to say.
Yeah, it doesn't get enough pushback in the culture. I'm glad to see people pushing back against the virulent Jew hatred in the last few months, and they've been vocal about it, and that's good. But the everyday hatred of white people coming from the left doesn't get enough blowback. We need to stand up. People in responsible positions need to stand up and say, this is not acceptable. This is irrational. It's racist. White people are evil, and part of the essence of critical race theory that's kids are indoctrinated with in the schools, the idea that white people are inherently, inveterately racist. I mean, it's just it's appalling. It's just virulent, anti-white, racist, vile racist hatred.
Do you think that ideas like CRT and in this whole anti-white racism has gone under the radar for so long because people don't take it seriously? It's like they think, well, that's just their emotions speaking or something. But if they were to make a rational write an academic paper about it and take it seriously, then people would be like, they would wake up and think the left were serious, and then it would be a real issue. Kind of like what's going on now when we're realizing that, these people were serious.
Yeah.
They really believe these things that they're just emotionally spouting out.
Yeah, they really do want to kill Jews, for example. They really are serious about that.
Do you think there's that issue where we haven't, like as a culture, we haven't taken them seriously because we think, that's just an emotional weirdo?
Yeah, and they're just they're emoting, they're overstating, they don't really believe, they don't really want to shoot white people in the head. I think part of our complacency here is that white Americans are still a majority, with 70 or 72% of the American population. We're not in any immediate danger from these lunatics, and so he's just kind of complacent about it. But this kind of racist dynamite left unanswered can metastasize, and it can grow. And one of the things I think that the Marxist left, because I distinguish between the Marxist left and the Nazi left, because the Nazis are leftists. We need to be clear on that. National Socialism is a form of collectivism and socialism, just like communism is. I think Richard Spencer and the so-called alt-right, these white supremacists who right now are a tiny marginalized group among 230 million white Americans. I think part of the goal, you remember the riots in Charlottesville, Virginia, when was that? August of 2017?
Right.
I think the Marxist left wants more of that. I mean, when they spew out white privilege and white people are all racists and every white person is a victimizer of non-whites in the United States. I mean, part of the goal here, the more innocent, innocuous part is to inculcate guilt, a sense of guilt and shame in white Americans, to make them more amenable to a massive redistribution of income, which is always a Marxist plan. To steal from the, to coercively redistribute wealth from the white middle class to some of the poor non-white, members of the non-white poverty class. That's a massive grift. As evil as that is, I think it's relatively innocuous to the second goal, which I think is they want to revive the white supremacist mentality in this country, the Richard Spencer types want a white ethno state. I think they're a tiny marginalized community right now, and I think the Marxist left wants to revive that. So if you get Nazis and KKK guys marching in the streets, waving swastikas and Confederate flags, and engaging in bloody street violence with Antifa and Black Lives Matter. This is part of what you were talking about before, William. I think the desire to take over the cities. You need violence. I mean, if you want to establish a totalitarian state in a relatively free society, I think you need two things. One, you need a totalitarian philosophy in the culture, and the Marxist left has that. They control the universities, the school system, the media, and so on. They have that.
Marx explicitly called for violent revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. They have that socialist, anti-capitalist mentality, completely controlling the intellectual culture. Excuse me, I had a cold. But two, you need massive street violence. It's how Mussolini came to power, with his black shirts, rioting in the streets. It's how Hitler came to power with his brown shirts, rioting in the streets and massive street violence against communists and union organizers.
Does that mean we can never take to the streets?
Yeah, well, massive street violence means that they can call openly for, making it very difficult, if not impossible, for honest, everyday, middle-class Americans to get to work and so on. And so, it makes it very easy for them to say capitalism has failed, freedom has failed, we need an authoritarianism to suppress the street violence, and they already have that philosophy deeply entrenched in the culture. So I think, and they don't have to worry about losing the battle to the Nazis, because they could use the Nazi threat as a boogeyman to push us into communism, because they not only control the culture, but they have vast superiority in numbers. There's millions of indoctrinated little Marxist leftists in the country. There's very few Nazi leftists in the country. So I think they want to revive the white supremacist mentality. I think that's part of it.
But it does go further than that, because you talk about the focus on colorblind individualism, but to the woke, it's like to be white is to be a supremacist, or to be for capitalism is to be a racist.
Yeah.
So it's tough. How much is it that they want to revive it, and how much is they just want to label all of us with that smear?
Yeah. I mean, that's true, but
I don't think it matters what we do. They're going to label whatever we do as white supremacist, because we're white. So we're white people acting in the world, and so we are white supremacists no matter what we do.
No, that's true. But
it's going to be a battle of rhetoric, in my opinion. Because
I hear you, William. But we, normal everyday white Americans who are honest and go to work and everything, we're not going to riot in the streets. It's not going to help their cause to establish totalitarianism. But this endless anti-white rhetoric about white privilege and white guilt and all that stuff, it will make some people feel guilty and more amenable to redistribution of income. But it's going to make other white people angry. They know it's going to make some white people angry. They're verbally abused day after day after day when we have to be less white. An objectivist friend of mine said, it's not going to go well for anybody who tells me I got to be less white. But it's going to make a lot of people angry. and I think they know that, and they want to see the real white supremacists rise because they're going to riot in the streets, and fight against Antifa and Black Lives Matter, against the Marxist terrorist groups. We're not. So that helps their cause. Is my
But
point.
you point out that the Proud Boys, for example, are white supremacists, that they've been painted that way, even with having Black and Hispanic members. And I mean, didn't they do that with the Tea Party, where they just kind of called them racist, which means, oh, you can't affiliate them now, with them now, to kind of virtue signal to us that you're not a racist, and they kind of affect our activity.
Right. Yeah, the Proud Boys are have been violent on some occasions, and some of them participated in the riots on January 6th, but they're not racist. Like you said, they have a number of Black, Latino, Asian members. Their website openly proclaimed they were anti-racist. They didn't discriminate on the basis of race or sexual orientation or anything like that. But Biden and the leftists generally stigmatize them as white supremacists. It's all of that is a general attempt to smear anybody who's considered conservative,
Right.
meaning a supporter of capitalism and individual rights to some degree, whether they're objectivists, libertarians, conservatives, classical, Wall Street economists, whatever it is, to stigmatize all supporters of capitalism, individual rights and freedom, all enemies of communism, as white supremacists and Nazis. It's an attempt to politically marginalize intellectually and politically marginalize their enemies.
Can I ask you,
Go ahead.
I don't know, maybe we'll switch topics here a little bit. In the book, you characterize the Civil Rights Act as an individual rights movement for Black people. But as you know, I believe that Ayn Rand was against the Civil Rights Act. She considered it one of the, what was the quote here? One of the worst breaches of property rights in the sorry record of American history. And she thought that it was, quote, an ironic demonstration of the philosophical insanity and the consequently suicidal trend of our age, that the men who need the protection of individual rights most urgently, the Negroes, are now in the vanguard of the destruction of these rights, end quote. So I'm just wondering, do you think we should repeal the Civil Rights Act, or at least part of it, in order to solve some of the institutional problems we have with racism today?
Well, I agree with Ayn Rand on the property rights issue. If I'm a racist white restaurateur, let's say, and the restaurant's my property, then the government should not be granted the power to force me to serve or employ people I don't want on my property. It's the same thing in my house. That's not the way to combat racism. The way to combat racism is, one, to point out to everybody that to educate people that colorblind individualism is the right philosophy. Educate, including my hypothetical bigoted restaurateur, that it's irrational to not serve black customers, and so on. Colorblind individualism is the panacea for racism in any of its hideous iterations, not the violation of a racist or an irrational person's property rights. So yeah, I don't think the government should be granted the power to dictate to people, that they have the power to force a baker, a very religious baker who doesn't want to make a cake for a gay marriage. So I don't think the government should be granted the power to force the baker to do so. What we need here is a moral and philosophic revolution in education. Colorblind individualism is the morally right philosophy. Race doesn't matter. Sexual orientation, is a minor point. Moral character is what matters. The moral character of somebody. So yeah, I think we should repeal the part of the Civil Rights Act that violates the property rights of people, including, let's put it this way: being irrational, and racism is irrational. Being an irrational racist doesn't mean you lose the right to dictate terms on your own property of who you'll associate with and who you won't. You don't lose your rights by being a racist, being irrational. What you should get from that is a lot of talking to from more rational people about how your philosophy is irrational, and that's not the right way to deal with people. The good news about the civil rights movement was that I think it raised the awareness in the United States of the long suffering history of the violations of the rights of Black Americans, including the basic right to vote. And the Jim Crow gradually died. The laws prohibiting integration, not forcing integration, but the laws prohibiting, and the laws enforcing segregation, the state laws enforcing segregation and prohibiting integration of neighborhoods and so on, or of restaurants, stores, and everything. Those Jim Crow laws faded away, were eventually repealed. That's why I think I quoted Confucius, that the beginning of wisdom is to see to it that things are called by their right names. The right name for the civil rights movement is the individual rights movement for Black Americans, and long overdue. And ironic, so there's a lot of good in that, in recognizing the individual rights of Black Americans, but it was mixed in with the anti-individual rights elements that you point out, William. So it was a package deal, a lot of good, but some bad in all of that.
I think it drove racists into kind of like this secret or hidden mentality where they don't feel like they can openly be racist and still function, because the law will come down on them. And so that sort of deprived our country of a natural erosion of racism, because it just went underground. And so now we've got the left accusing people or white people of being inherent racists, and you're a racist even if you don't realize it. So there's always going to be this charge that, oh, you're just concealing your racism. And I think that in part is because of the Civil Rights Act and what it did to the racists and forcing them underground.
That's an interesting point, and I think it's I see it as more complex. I think the civil rights movement, raised the awareness for many white Americans, and I think you started to see a genuine erosion of white racism. I think today, anti-Black or anti-non-white racism amongst white Americans is much lower than it was in the past, and I gave a whole bunch of evidence, in the book. One of those, that Pew Research Center's survey on interracial marriage. There's very few white Americans oppose it today, whereas in the past, so the numbers to that were much higher. I think it's a genuine, a good effect. It was a genuine erosion of white racism. It became a shameful thing to be a racist, and it should be. Somebody should be ashamed if they are, because it's irrational. I think, but I agree with you that if somebody is a racist, they should speak up and speak out, and their freedom of speech shouldn't be. First of all, they have the right to free speech as long as they're not advocating violence. They have that right is sacred for anybody. But second of all, if the rights of racists to speak up and spew out their racial hatreds are protected, we know who the racists are. We know where people stand. We have freedom of speech too. We can answer them rationally.
But it goes back to the double standard, because
ourselves against.
If you're openly racist against the groups that it's okay to be racist against in today's society, it's just, you can still be elected to Congress. But if you it's the wrong group, they're gonna, you talked about bakery in Oberlin. The university kind of accused the bakery there of having racist owners, and it was, it was just kind of trashed until the owners had to shut it down. They ended up suing Oberlin and winning. But that's, there's kind of these struggle sessions and just the dominant cultural mores, which I mean, I'm not advocating for racism, but even if you wanted to be an open racist, you have to make sure it's against the right groups today.
Yes, it's got to be against white people, and in on the university campuses and some other contexts, I guess certainly on the universities against Jews. But go back to also integrating this with William, your point from before. I think what drove white racism underground, in the sense, first of all, I think there's a genuine diminution of it, which is a good thing. But what drove it underground in the sense that they can't speak up wasn't so much the Civil Rights Movement or Civil Rights Act. I think it's the eventual or subsequent domination by the part of postmodernist philosophy in our universities, which raised this anti-white philosophy to a strong cultural level. Because postmodernist philosophy, I'm thinking here of Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, people like that. I think of them as Marxist on steroids, and as Marx divided society into classes rather than individuals, and there's the oppressor and the oppressed, and he defined that narrowly in economic terms. The rich exploit the poor, but the postmodernists, it says, well, it's not just that; it's also white people exploit victimize non-whites, males oppress females, straights oppress gays, and there's the seething. Western society is the seething struggle between oppressor and oppressed groups, and white males, especially white heterosexual males, became the real bad guy, and it became they became a special target. And if some white person really was bigoted against blacks, let's say, if he speaks up now, he's going to have his head handed to him. He's just going to be, the left is just going to be merciless on him.
If it weren't illegal to discriminate against blacks in hiring, I think a lot of business owners who are racist would just come right out and say, I'm only going to hire whites because, I think whites are better. And you'd be able to identify them as the racist. But I think because it's illegal to do that, they find other ways to conceal their racism and then, not hire blacks in some way. And then the left can come at the whole white race and say, look, there are those of you who conceal your racism. And, then it becomes the general charge of everyone is an inherent racist. So this is just a theory that I'm putting out, but I think some of these accusations of inherent racism are being motivated by this phenomenon that happened due to the illegality of racism in hiring.
It's that's just a way to cow people into submission.
It's an interesting theory, guys. I'm just not sure how much genuine white racism there is left in the country. How many white business owners don't want to hire blacks as opposed to want to hire on the merit system? My guess is that most white American business owners in our day are sufficiently rational, want to make money. They want their workers to be productive, and they'll hire blacks, Latinos, Asians, whites, male, female, whatever, whoever does the job best. I don't think there's that much anti-non-white male racism, or bigotry in the country anymore, and certainly not amongst business owners. But I don't have any hard data. Sure. I don't have any hard data to support that. I just don't think it's as white nearly as. Let's put it this way: I think we made a lot of progress on that amongst white Americans over the last 60 years.
Yeah. Just to switch gears a little bit, you also talk about in the book how Neanderthals and sapiens interacted, and maybe they intermixed some, or maybe even one group, or even the sapiens maybe wiped out the Neanderthals. But I mean, do the is that is racism to some extent, or that type of thing that hardwired into us, and we're thinking we're gonna, get over it with a few pieces of legislation?
Well, I pointed out a lot of historical examples of brutal racism. It's hardly limited to America. The Armenian genocide is one, the Holocaust is one, the Bengali genocide in 1971, the Rwandan genocide. There's so many examples there. The rape of Nan King. There's endless examples of racism, and one possible one. Those previous ones I just mentioned are all certainties, as atrocities perpetrated by based on racial hatreds. A hypothetical one is what happened to the Neanderthals. And it turns out, and this comes from Yuval Harari's book *Sapiens*, and Yuval Harari is a dubious character, but but *Sapiens*, his book *Sapiens* is it seems to be based on on state-of-the-art anthropological research, and but anyhow, when we were kids, we were taught that the Neanderthals were kind of like a missing link, between earlier primates and us, sapiens, human beings. Turns out, at least, this looks like what the anthropologists today are saying, that the sapiens and the Neanderthals was human as we are, just a different species in the broad class, in the broad Homo family.
Were they a different race?
Different species.
But they could have offspring.
Yeah, it's just like, and when you think about it, why shouldn't it be? Just like there's lions and tigers, and not bears, but lions and tigers and jaguars, part of the different species within the broad cat family, and they can interbreed. You get the liger, it's offspring of a male lion and a female tiger. You get the tiglon, offspring of a male tiger and a female lion. Why shouldn't there be different human species on Earth, evolved in different parts of the world?
As long as everyone gets along.
Yeah, well, they didn't. And all of these, not surprising, given how much racism and racial hatreds and violence there's been all over the world historically.
Well, I think that's where I was going with the question. I mean, do the postmodernists maybe have a point that much of history is about power struggles?
Oh, yeah, yes. They're empirically, I think there's a lot of truth to this. This is part of the theme in my novel, Reckoning. The race war comes to America. That the main racist, who's a black nationalist, points. He's a brilliant student of history. Points this out. That race. This is the Nazi mentality. The driving force of social history is race war, not class war. That's the Marxist view. But the impelling force of human history is race war. And unfortunately, there's a lot of empirical data, to support this, including what probably happened to the Neanderthals. Now, evidently, people of Middle Eastern and European ancestry have some average. On average, the DNA on average is 1% to 4% Neanderthal. First thing I thought of when I read that was I thought of the Nazis, racial purity. That on average they're 1% to 4% Neanderthal. But I guess it's not funny. So they interbred, and assimilation is certainly possible as to what happened to the Neanderthals. They simply might have assimilated, into the sapien tribe, more or less. But knowing the history that you're pointing out, Scott, the history of endless racial violence, it's very possible that this was species war to the death. And you can just imagine the heartbreaking Romeo and Juliet stories, of a male Neanderthal and a female sapien who loved each other in their species, not just families fighting to death or even races, but entire species, fighting to the death. Yes, there's a lot of evidence supporting the claim that human history is filled with racial, in this case, species conflict. But the point is, I think historically and empirically, there's a lot of truth to that. But if we're going to say that, like the postmodernists do, that this is hardwired into human nature. There's a technical term for that in philosophy. It's called bullshit. There's human beings are the rational animal. We have, not that we always act rationally, but we have the capacity to act rationally, and we have the capacity to understand that moral character of an individual is what matters. The moral choices is what matters, not their racial origin or their species origin. And we can overcome this. We have the capacity to overcome these kind of racial hatreds and endless violence because of our rational faculty.
I think it took a long time historically for mankind to realize that that our faculty of reason was the main ingredient of humanness. So it's
Aristotle in the 4th century BC, after thousands and thousands and thousands of years of what we call prehistory, because we don't have any records. But yeah.
Even after Aristotle, it took a long time for the world to accept that, and to this day, the whole world hasn't accepted it.
Yeah.
So
right. Exactly right. That's exactly right. And that rationality makes us human, regardless of gender, race, tribe, or species. In the case of the Neanderthals, evidently, the rational faculty makes us human. And and that individuality is real. You and I and anybody is first, foremost, and always an individual member of the human race, not primarily a member of this tribe or that tribe. And what really important about me or you or any of us is the moral choices we make, not the amount of pigmentation in our skin, not the tribe we were born into. Well, that's trivial. It's right. It's real. It's true, but it's trivial. Just like, amongst white people, some have blonde hair, some have brown hair, some have blue eyes, some have green eyes, and so on and so forth. It's true, but it's trivial. Moral character is what matters.
Different levels of intelligence among individuals.
Yeah, true.
Charles Murray years ago wrote about IQs of the races, and he didn't mean it to be racist. At least that's what he said, even though many racists kind of took up and said, aha, he's showing, but as a result, there's this thing where I feel like a lot of people have to just act like we're all just inherently equal and have the exact same capacity for intelligence to prove they're not a racist.
Yeah, and I understand. And that's granting, way too much power to the left, that we have to kowtow to them. We have to deny reality in order to avoid being criticized or being crucified by the left. Individuals vary in every characteristic, including intelligence. I don't know if intelligence generally varies from race to race. I know there are people who believe it. It's a scientific question and will need to be established. What's the belief that Asians generally are the most intelligent, that white people are second, and blacks are least intelligent in general. Again, we would need to see, that proven. What is it about being Asian biologically that leads to a higher degree of rational consciousness, ability to understand, intellectual issues, and so on and so forth? That would be neat.
I had a theory that both Jews and Indians having a strong oral tradition in their history before things got written down and kind of memorizing it helped with their memories through their descendants.
Yeah, having a strong cultural emphasis on education will certainly help. If the children are raised to be readers, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if out of the same family, wouldn't be surprised if the kids who are raised to be readers, as they grow older, will score higher on IQ tests than the kids who were raised to not be readers, or not allowed to read, or not encouraged to read, and didn't read. I wouldn't be surprised, but again, these are scientific questions. What I can say as a philosopher is this: first of all, it doesn't matter regarding moral character and individual rights. Somebody who's more intelligent than somebody else doesn't have any more rights than the less intelligent person. If somebody comes out of a race that's proven to be generally more intelligent than other races, doesn't have any more political rights or legal rights than anybody else. The issue of individual rights doesn't rest upon intelligence or the intelligence of a race. Moral character is, intelligence gives us the capacity to understand moral issues. But on the other hand, we know there are people of very modest intelligence who are just good. They're good people. They take personal responsibility. They're honest. They're peaceful. They're not violent. Moral character doesn't depend on intelligence. And even if one race generally is more intelligent than another, it does, it's still people are individuals. Some
Right.
Asians will be, if they're the smartest race generally, some Asians will be, not so bright. And if blacks are supposed to be the least intelligent race, they're going to be black geniuses like George Washington Carver and Thomas Sowell and Ben Carson and Duke Ellington. People like that. They're still going to be geniuses, from the supposedly less intelligent race and the, not so intelligent people from the supposedly more intelligent race. We still have to judge each individual as he or she is, regardless of what race they're born into.
I think one of the major issues surrounding racism is the question of what is race. Sometimes it gets confused. Ayn Rand had this theory of anti-concepts, and she identified ethnicity as an anti-concept, which conflates race and culture. So I think if we continue to confuse the issue of race, we're not going to solve it. We're not going to solve the problem of racism. I think we should get rid of this idea that race has anything to do with culture. It has to do with physical characteristics. It's your skin color, maybe some particular unique facial features or strength or something like that. But culture is what I think really you should judge people on. Like what are your traditions? What are your beliefs? What are your practices? These are the things that you have control over and should be judged upon, not judged upon your race.
Yeah, I agree, William. It would be an enormous step forward if we could just dismiss the idea of race altogether, other than the obvious facts that there are some racial differences in skin color, hair color, bone structure in the face, so on. That there are obvious physical characteristics, and other than that, dismiss the idea. It doesn't matter. It simply doesn't matter. What matters are individual members of the human race. It's a cliche to say it, but it's true and important. There's one race and only one race, and that's the human race. And we can get to that point, just like, amongst white people, even with the dumb blonde jokes, people, I don't think people really take that seriously. I don't think people really expect blonde women to be less intelligent than brunettes or so on. It's a form of humor. I think, amongst white people, we accept, doesn't matter, what color hair this person has, what color eyes, they have, that has no impact on what really matters, and that's their moral character. If we could just advance to that point, more broadly about race, it doesn't matter whether somebody, has fair skin, dark skin, straight hair, curly hair, whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is character. Human race has to get to that point. We haven't been able to yet. It's been a long struggle, but one Ayn Rand quote I love is when she said, "It's earlier than we think." We're still very early.
But yet, in your last chapter, you're talking about the, potential for a race war. It doesn't have to happen, but it could. What are our odds of, evolving past that?
Well, I think as long as the Marxist left controls the intellectual culture and continue, the postmodernists, control the intellectual culture, they're going to continue to spew out anti-white hatred. Was it Coca-Cola had that training mantra? We have to be less white. They're gonna continue to spew out this anti-white racism, and it's social dynamite. It's for the reasons that I already said. It's one of the effects of that may well be it becomes possible to create a resurgence of the pretty much moribund white supremacist mentality in the United States. Is right now amongst 234 million white supremacists, I mean, 234 million white Americans. There's
Those are
very
lefty
few.
numbers.
Yeah, exactly. There's very few white supremacists. You talk to educated white people, I do it all the time. They don't even know who Richard Spencer is, and he's the leading example of an intellectual, white, once a white ethno state. They don't even, most of them don't even know who he is. But it's possible, when you look at the riots in Charlottesville, Virginia, there were like dozens, maybe scores of white supremacists. There had thousands of counter protesters. There were maybe at the most there were several hundred white supremacists. They were vastly outnumbered by their enemies. They're a tiny marginalized subset amongst 234 million white Americans. But you keep spewing out an endless mantra of how evil white people are. You're going to anger a lot of people, and you're going to a lot of white
And
people.
ginning up hate among people who wouldn't have been racially hateful of white people on their own.
Yeah, exactly. And they're going to be angry and they're going to be afraid. And they may, to protect themselves from the anti-white mentality, they may, gravitate towards these miserable, these wretched white supremacist organizations. The Klan today, mercifully, has very few members. The American Nazi Party today has very few members. There's very few of them. But it's going to grow. I'll predict it ominously. I hope I'm wrong. But balefully, I think they're going to grow. The white supremacist groups are going to grow as the Marxist left that controls the universities and the intellectual culture continues to spew out virulent anti-white hatred.
One of the greatest things to happen lately, I believe, is this protest against the Ivy League presidents and forcing them to quit because of their beliefs. There should be a lot more of that, a lot more exposure of this vile ideology, and put as much public pressure as possible on these colleges to change and get rid of.
No, you exactly. It was nice to see a number of donors. Well, I'm not giving any more money to you. You spew out this kind of racist hatred, against whites, against Jews, whatever. It's good to see the donors rise up in rebellion. It's good to see public opinion, rise up and say, this kind of hatred should not be spewed out on college campuses. The FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, ranked Harvard 248 out of 248 universities, dead last on the principle of promoting free speech. That if anybody speaks up against this anti-white hatred at Harvard or other leading universities, they're going to be canceled. They're going to be suppressed. Maybe graded down, maybe threatened. Maybe physically intimidated. We need to see more pushback. Claudine Gay at Harvard, it's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's hundreds of faculty members who share those same race, anti-white. Maybe they're not plagiarists like she is, but there's hundreds of anti-white and anti-Jew, racists on the faculty of these campuses. It's the dominance of postmodern philosophy. Marxism had been coming to dominate the schools of education, the school system, the humanities divisions of our universities all through the 20th century. Postmodernists, Marxists on steroids, I think by the late 20th century, had come to dominate the humanities programs. And now, with those philosophies firmly entrenched in humanities programs in our universities, they just spew out this endless anti-white hatred, and it's going to continue. It's part of their core philosophy.
One of the best activist donors at Harvard, Bill Ackman, had a tweet that I wanted to just briefly quote. He said, I ultimately concluded that anti-Semitism was not at the core of the problem. It was a troubling warning sign, the canary in the coal mine. What I learned was that DEI was not about diversity in its purest form, but rather DEI was a political advocacy movement on behalf of certain groups that are deemed oppressed under DEI's own methodology.
Right.
And exactly. I mean, just that he's starting to see it now gives some hope that it's going more mainstream to push back on this.
Yeah, and also I want to give some props to Elon Musk, who I disagree with on this, that, or the other thing, but he in many cases strongly supports freedom of speech. And now you could speak out on a major social media platform like Twitter, and or X, and not have to worry about being canceled. Whereas if you come out and display these sentiments, let's say on Facebook, you might get deplatformed for, on YouTube or whatever. You might get deplatformed for some period of time, or maybe even permanently. But I'm glad Elon Musk has stood up for freedom of speech, and he literally put his money where his mouth is.
Absolutely. And they tried to paint him as an anti-Semite or a bigot.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
So, but I think he's been one of the good guys. William, any final questions?
I just wanted to say that in the third chapter, you make an interesting logical point about the failure of the postmodernists to address racists, because the racists can just come back at the postmodernists and say, well, this is my racial truth, quote unquote. You have your racial truth and I have my racial truth, and they're both equal, blah, blah, blah. So the woke postmodern Marxist has no comeback for the racists. And so they will be ineffective at fighting racism. The fight has to come from the right, the conservatives, who say we have inalienable individual rights, you have a right to your own life, property, and so forth. And that's the proper argument against racists. So we just have a better argument.
Yeah. No, absolutely right. The postmodernist view is very, Kantian, Hegelian, Marxist, and that is that different races and the two different genders cognize the world differently. We have, in Kantian terms, we have different fundamental categories by means of which we understand the world. And in effect, there's no dictionary of translation. So there's no way we can understand each other, and or rationally adjudicate the inevitable disagreements that arise amongst human beings. So they've gone back philosophically and openly to the sophists, to Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, that force is the ultimate arbiter of human disputes, and we're enjoined to side with the oppressed, against the evil oppressor. But the point then is, if let's say they were right about the white race being this dominant, this brutally dominant race, and and everything, then the white oppressor could simply come back to them and say, hey, wait a minute, what is this discussion of oppressed and oppressor that has moral principles packed into it? There's no moral truth. Truth is racial. Morality is racial. That's your racial claims, that we're a oppressor, to the oppressor, that we're the bad guys. Our racial truth is that we're heroes, and we're stronger, and we dominate the weak. There's no such thing as objective right and wrong. There's only strength and weakness. We're the strong. We intend to keep it that way. You don't like it? Pound sand. And there's you're right. There's no comeback from the Marxists. They can't say they reject an objective truth. Truth is racial. All they can come back and say is, but we don't like it. And the Nazi mentality, go bleep you. You're next in the ovens. So yeah, they have no moral argument. The Marxist left, dominated by postmodernist principles today. There's no objective right and wrong. There's no objective morality. There's only racial truth. There's only racial right and wrong. They have no answer to any dominant group, whether they're who've literally oppressed people and physically impose their will on others, whether they're white or otherwise. They have no answer other than that we don't like it.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you for joining us today. It's American Racism. It's available on Amazon or probably anywhere new books are sold. You're very prolific, so hopefully we'll at least have you back by your next piece or book, and maybe even sooner. But I see the people that you're talking to, and you are willing to reach out to other groups, and I think it's very brave of you. And I think it's an example not only for others in the movement, but also just for getting along better in society. People willing to say, I'm going to do things my own way. So thank you for everything and just being out there, and we appreciate you.
Well, I thank you. I appreciate that. And thanks for having me on, Scott and Williams. Always good talking to you guys. Always good being on your show.
Great. Well, thanks. Well, this is the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig, and we will see you next time.